subsidised for growers and people wanting to do all the good work of all of this food production. So yeah, hopefully come along to those as well. Um, cool. I'm going to make a start. So first of all, a little introduction to, I guess, the why of market gardening. And yes, for me, this has been like something I've been like so passionate about for like 10 years, just like completely nerded out and obsessed over trying to make this work as a livelihood and grow food for community. And I think it's a real key in terms of like reconnecting food, people, and place, as I'm sure you guys are also aware. So there's a few bits that are key for like the why market gardening in particular for me, and I see market gardening as I guess it's like the small on the smaller scale side of growing, but also traditional market gardens in this country would have been could have been 8 acres or 15 acres or whatever. It's the principles is more of like growing uh, majority like direct to a community or very, as direct as possible and growing with quite a lot of diversity and sort of focusing on environmental outcomes as well. So it's like the keys in the game is like it's like gardening, but it's for a market. So I'd call it like livelihood gardening is maybe better because it's not just about the sort of market, but it's all like livelihoods and communities, things like that. And one reason I think it's really good is it's kind of a good entrance way, kind of good way for new entrants to get in, like relatively accessible in the sense of potential, hand tools, quick learning, connection with the plants and the soil, and so many different ways to do it. So it's really accessible. It's also potentially very economically viable. When we look at the farms around us in our valley, there's 1,000 acre farms that are debt driven and can employ one person at max and rely on contracting. And then there's we're employing 6 people on 15 acres with living wage, and the market garden is produced. So, well, this year it's produced about £95,000 from less than 2 acres. So it's actually only an acre and a half of beds. Um, and not that that's market garden metrics are so tricky because you can have a quarter acre plot in the middle of a city, like the sort of urban farm model, which can generate 100 grand on half an acre or something like that. And likewise, you can have a 30-acre field veg farm that generates half of that on a huge area. So the metrics are kind of quite vague, really. But that's I guess like our numbers of what we've developed over from kind of 10 years of focusing on soil health, focusing on the economics, and trying to make the market garden really efficient. And the labour time for the market garden has decreased over time because we had a kind of perennial approach and permaculture design to starting it up, and the soil health has increased and gone up over time, and the productivity and the food supply has gone up over that 10 years. So that's why I'm really passionate about it, because I think it's like that's amazing for local communities and for growers and for livelihoods, and it has that potential, albeit within the tricky economic conditions of today. So the aim of this session is to really partly to sort of showcase some examples and some methods and some tips around that market gardening model, which I and we have learned over the years from lots of amazing mentors and from lots of awful mistakes and from lots of I've set up market gardens probably in every single different way possible in the book Under the Sun and on lots of different sites, and also advised and consulted for lots of farms and market gardens more recently, to kind of hopefully share those mistakes and lessons and show the successes of where we've made it work really well. And all of these other reasons for like the why of market gardening. And you guys might have many more as well that might be sort of personal to you. But for me, it's all about health and reconnection to the land and the kind of cultural and historic roots of market gardening. It's a good connection point to also like a lot of sometimes conventional growers, like nearby us, for example, they're like, oh yeah, my granddad used to do market gardening. It's quite a, I guess, kind of an inclusive bridge building approach that a lot of people can understand, because Bath, for example, used to be dotted with market gardens. Um, I find it a really fun, varied, meaningful, joyful livelihood. So it kind of meets that ikigai, which is your kind of purpose, passion, livelihood. So for me, it ticks those boxes, and it's just so varied, and every day is like, completely different and varied, and that's what I kind of love about it and thrive off from it. But also we'll touch on later about how we sort of like optimize and get the functional diversity and not In my earlier years market gardens, they were, because I loved that variation, I had to check myself for it to not be uh, too crazy and chaotic, I guess, and still refining that as we go. Um, and I also see market gardening as this real like yeah kind of gateway into a wider regenerative movement. It's a way to like learn about the land, to kind of get into that husbandry and that custodianship of land, and it's a way to really like yeah just like learn about soil and get into this whole like broader regenerative shift and wider movement that we're kind of part of, just by starting to learn how to grow our food, which was a big motivation for me at the start. And also potential in terms of the broader food systems project and the kind of broader shift towards more sustainable food resilience, food security, whatever we call it. Market gardening and providing like fresh food to local communities seems like in a way, a low hanging fruit. Obviously, there's lots of complexities to it, but it seems like if we can get that bit right and support and grow for local communities, then that's a great place to start. It's sort of nuts that we still import a lot of our fresh produce and things that can grow really well in the UK. And finally, I sort of see it as like a stepping stone towards natural farming. I kind of came from a very like permacultural background, studying permaculture like 12 years ago, and then was much more into the sort of lifestyle farming and self-sufficiency and things. And now I'm more in the sort of community resilience mindset, and yeah, believe in that sort of more like wider picture stuff. But I see market gardening as like that kind of bridge towards that more like idealistic natural farming, permacultural kind of design. It's kind of like an ecological succession. So, for example, some market gardens have sort of designed and implemented. Once the market gardens get in there onto like whether it's pasture or whether it's degraded land, the market garden kind of brings back the fungal life to the soil. It begins to bring more diversity of roots, and the soil starts to shift. And then you can kind of begin to integrate perennials, and then begin to integrate other things. And the market garden can be this kind of succession towards a really um, long-term sort of natural farming design, I guess. And I've sort of seen that with our market garden, like because the soil health is going up and up and up. In a way, the labour input per level of output and productivity is um, yeah, there's like less labor required over time, but it did take a lot to start up. So yeah, that's a few reasons of the why market garden. I think it's always nice to start with before going into like the practical, nerdy, boring. Well, not boring. I find it really exciting, but kind of the more the bits that growers don't often like to look at, the sort of more like numbers and the yeah, the spreadsheets and things like that. Which we're not going to do loads of actually, but I think it's good just to touch on the what the why. I guess I've also kind of labeled this webinar as like for successful market gardening, which is not like an arrogance thing or anything. It's just that actually for me, like success means all of these things. So it's all about obviously we've got to prioritize the economic success sometimes and make sure we're getting that, obtaining the yield, getting the livelihood from that growing and market gardening. But there's all these other forms of capital that I believe, like market gardening, community farming, organic growing, can all bring to us if we, once we kind of get those designs right and continue learning from each other, and sort of, yeah, building and constantly refining and optimizing the systems. So all the other forms of capital, the learning, it's kind of lifelong learning is market gardening, the sort of spiritual or land-based or cultural connection as well, experiential, material, social, ecological, of course, and cultural capital as well. And for me, the real driver of this and why I consider sort of yeah market gardening to be the sort of the greatest success, I guess, to try and make work, is because it kind of follows this like ikigai. So it's which is like from Japanese philosophy about where you're, what you love, you can do what the world needs and what you can be paid for and get a livelihood from, and what you're good at and can develop gifts and skills in, where all of that overlaps is the kind of ikigai. And that's I guess what I lean into and what motivates the market gardening work, because I think that drive is the key piece to the kind of economics and all the other stuff. Well, to put it a bit naively, can work itself out once yeah, we're sort of in those, but we also need lots of systems to make sure it does work out. And a bit of context about where I grow and our market garden. As I said, we've set up lots and helped to form lots of market gardens. But this is the kind of main site. We're middle ground growers, just on our main base is called Western Spring Farm, so that's on the edge of Bath. It's 16 acres, and it's got a very mixed permaculture design that we co-designed as a group, a community, well, a group of co-growers in 2020. So about 5 years ago, we started on some pasture land and set about this design basically as a community, and then we implemented the market garden, the field veg, the agroforestry, the wetlands, and the solar water cycling systems. So we've got spring water on the lower field that we pump up to the top. Um, Delivery bikes and a van and infrastructure like a solar barn to have a smooth workflow from the market garden through to the wash station, pack station, into the delivery bikes or the van, and then out really fresh to community and customers. So that's a very brief overview of the site. And yeah, the market garden is like under 2 acres of that site. So you can see there's kind of like 9 small blocks, small squares, which is mostly the market garden. And there's a bit of alley cropping garden space in the fruit and nut orchard just next to that as well. So it's only an acre and a half of beds, um, but that produces as much income as the whole rest of the land combined. So it's about £95,000. And yeah, I'll talk a bit through, I guess, how we get to those numbers in terms of like how we focus on certain crops, how we minimize labor, how we kind of optimize the system, standardize the beds, um, processes for, yeah, whether it's bed flip or design efficiency and all the other stuff that comes with it. That's the market garden from this year. So we added more beds every year and more blocks, and yeah, I think we're up to what we've got nine. There's 9 blocks. Each block has 20 beds. Each bed is 1.2 meters by 20 meters, and that's the kind of standardization we've gone for. We did start with the 75 centimeter beds, but we sort of changed that as we kind of merged our system with some of the field growing to make sure we can use, if we need to use the front loader on the tractor to make composted beds, or if we need to use the transplanter, or if we need to, yeah, do anything there, we can kind of align those systems. In practice, we don't really use the tractor much in the garden because actually the sort of market garden tools are just so efficient and so quick, and we've got the system down, I guess, so we can do it with quite minimal work without having to change machinery implements and all these sort of things and compact the ground. So we have the flexibility for that, but we've also got this system. So we made the beds a bit wider. It still worked with all the market garden tools, and the 1.2 meters is really good for just generating a bit more space of growing per area. But it'll be different for every system. So yeah, do your research and get the sort of standardize the beds as much as you can. You guys got any questions or curiosities at that point before we go into a bit more of the sort of market garden journey? Cool, yeah. Um, mm, mm, mm. And yeah, the sort of story of I guess like my market gardening journey and also how the middle ground market garden has evolved. So it was about 12 years ago. I was just doing more like community growing, allotments, and things like that, and also working on a few smaller farms, just kind of getting some experience. I left school and then immediately went traveling and worked on a diversity of farms. I was just hitchhiking between farms, volunteering on no money for a year and a half, and yeah, absolutely loved it. Got some paid roles on various farms in New Zealand and some in other countries. Traveled a lot around Asia, learned a lot about the kind of quite traditional methods of like quite bio-intensive, really like feeding the soil a lot with a lot of like composting methods and mulches, and like cyclical water systems, but also like huge yields that we wouldn't even imagine if we look at sort of field growing today. So lots of inspiration from, I guess, farms globally, and then really began to kind of nerd out on how I apply that to the context. So looking at lots of temperate farm examples, began to like nerd out on all the JM Fortier stuff and the Richard Perkins things and all the different market gardens that were seemingly matching the economics with the ecology as well. And yeah, loads of different learnings from that, kind of taking the useful bits from each of those, and I guess discarding the rest. And yeah, really just began on very small plots. So that was, I think, the key to developing quite a high yielding, quite focused model to try and get as much as I can from a small area. So I was just on half an acre on our previous site years and years ago, and then that enabled me to kind of like really refine the technique, the approach to soil, and all these things on that small scale. And then we kind of went through a phase of, I guess, doubling every year once that initial small model was built. And we had just a huge demand, so we doubled from just doing 25 veg boxes on half an acre, which was really heavily cropping, and then sort of doubling to like 65 veg boxes on an acre and a half. That was our old site, with two full-time equivalent growers, and deliverers and everything like that. Then jumped up again to 120 veg boxes. This is the kind of COVID years that some of you might remember in terms of the market peaks, and suddenly there's full focus on growing. So then we sort of go up to like 3.5 full-time equivalent. We sort of begin to become viable in 2022, pay off some of the startup costs, and yeah, it did really. It took some years to make the market garden more viable, and it wasn't necessarily due to the scale. Like I think it's very doable to make it viable on a small scale. As I said, there's lots of models of like urban farms that really make it work on half an acre to an acre, but with that's quite a focus, I guess. But yeah, I think as we began to like be able to grow the team and get more different skill sets and a bit more land, it did become easier as well. So now we're up to these slides are a little bit outdated now, but yeah, sort of up to, we've got like 200 veg box subscriptions, and that's about half the business. The rest of the business, the middle ground, is wholesale and markets, and we're on about, well, it's about 2 acres market garden, and the field crops we're now leasing another field, so we're just over 10 acres there for this year. But focusing on the market garden side of all of that journey today. And just to throw in a little bit of the wider context, so there's these really great reports in terms of like the UK context of obviously just the importance of fresh food and local agroecological food systems, and they're just like really good reference points if you're ever looking at the sort of wider systemic impacts and benefits of the need for market gardens and fresh food. But I'm sure I don't need to persuade you guys on anything like that. And these are some like really big early inspirations for me, like just reading the real nerdy details of like in Elliot Coleman's book about like hoeing method and how to hold the grip on the hand of the tool, and all these different like nerdy details that then could then apply to every single aspect of farm and business, and kind of learn how it works in our context was really key. So yeah, Elliot Coleman, J.M. Fortier, and lots of others, kind of inspiring books, and I think it's really essential in those to get to that point of like market gardening, sort of more like holistic success, to just like really have that phase of nerding out and like obsessing over the different YouTube videos, the reading, the kind of lifelong learning part of that, or other modes of learning. Everyone has different approaches and styles, and webinars and useful things, learning from other growers, visiting as many farms as possible is so useful. Like learn so much from like visiting farms, not just like really good model farms. Like every farm has its issues and challenges, but actually going around and seeing like, oh, what's like the biggest struggle here, or what's like been the challenge, or what did you learn from this mistake of setting up those beds, and really like harvesting all that, and lots of notes and sort of harvesting of all of that information is really useful. And just a sort of summary of just two of those information streams, like the J.M. Fortier School, of kind of what he teaches in his books and webinars. There's a really good 6-part YouTube series on like, I think it's called Profitable Market Gardening. It just goes through a lot of the different systems, bed standardization, winter growing, the economics for success, and all those sort of things. So that's really inspired me a lot. And his sort of model is really like about like small is profitable. Don't grow it beyond what you can actually earn more from a 1.5 acre market garden than you can sometimes from dozens and dozens and dozens of fields. That's not to say don't be afraid of scaling, because at some point it's good to have that scaling. But I think this sort of smallest profitable thing is really can be actually really key in market gardening. And he's really like reinforcing this, like you can make a good livelihood and a good lifestyle through this, through sort of over time as well. He sort of acknowledged it takes years to get to that as well, and takes that sort of willingness and intent and lots of other factors. And Jane Fortier really focused on this kind of bio-intensive approach, like really close, dense plant spacing, so lots of living roots in the ground, lots of diversity of crops, some intercropping, focusing on your profitable crops. Trying to start with quite modular, small startup costs, like just a few of the essential basic tools, trying to, not do yourself over with debt at the start. And yeah, really efficient processes just for the simple stuff. Trying to make sure you're spending a lot of your time harvesting and sowing and doing the direct stuff that's going to income generate for your farm, which we'll dive into a bit more detail later. And then the Elliot Coleman School was kind of all about yeah, he was the sort of the wise elder of like all the sort of like the techniques and the mastery, and I really learned from that of like market gardening as craft. So really like not just seeing it as this job, or you like learn a few things and then you grow in it and then it's just sewing and that's it. It's really like a craft, like it would be to become a metal worker, a woodworker, an artist, all of those things. And even just on the detail of like nailing your hoeing practice, or that bed flip process, or the sort of micro body postures of planting, which even if they just make a few percent difference each time, and then you're doing it like for I don't know how many hundreds of hours over your lifetime or over your week, then those little micro movements and differences in body position really make a difference. And so yeah, I really like that. I try and still apply it. I sort of often forget it in the in the later years now, but actually it's really key to sort of come back to that of like really kind of detail orientation in a bit without getting stuck in the detail. And yeah, Elliot Coleman also, sort of talk about that, bringing like productivity and ecology together, and lots of lessons on like crop protection. Probably like the best resource for like winter growing. Elliot Coleman's from a very similar climate to ours, so it's actually much more transferable than you might think across the Atlantic. Um, so yeah, loads of useful things like that, and lots more from other resources. And then moving into the kind of like design considerations of a market garden. So firstly, like looking at approach, and we moved from a very small market garden, no till, no dig. That was kind of the original focus of the market garden. So very bio-intensive, very heavily cropping, um, lots of startup work. So you've got to like get those composted beds in, compost cardboard, really thick layers to make sure the weeds don't come back, and sometimes they still do. Quite a bit of input time. And I think over time, I sort of see that no dig approach really working on a certain scale of market garden and being really, quite economic and things like that. And you can make it work really well. But I think beyond anything above an acre, even that, maybe even above three-quarters of an acre or something, is quite tricky to do the no dig thing really well. Just in terms of like time to maintain all those beds, time to make them work properly. Like if you're going to go, I think if you're going to go for the no dig thing, sort of almost go for it fully on a smaller area, and then it will be really productive. Like it could just be like for the salads block of the farm, or which you can actually, continuous crop because the soil health's so good. So it could just be there's a mini rotation with the no dig beds, but we're kind of moving towards more of a sort of min till system. So we do actually still do some land cultivation, and the market garden, now it's getting up towards the more 2 acre size. And we do have the tools on site like a BCS two-wheel tractor. So we actually kind of embrace a more middle ground approach in terms of, for example, the salad block and the spinach block is quite clean, lean, composted beds that we actually reset every year, which is quite a lot of winter work, but it's also really worthwhile because they're very productive. And it saves us a lot of time in the summer. So it evens out our labour flow through the year. But it wouldn't be worthwhile us, I think, doing that every year on all the areas of the land and all the acreage and things like that. So we kind of find a minimum in betweeny approach. So for things like the market garden blocks where we're just doing radish and spring onions and things like that, we will probably do some minimal cultivation, especially if we need to reset a bed quite quickly. And then in some areas we'll use we sort of utilize tarps a lot. So we use like landscape membrane. It's this dark green, like stabilized stuff, so it's not like disintegrating like some plastics and tarps. It's still obviously using plastic, so there's a trade-off, but we've definitely moved towards that more kind of minimum till system. Also using the tarps where we need to just like reset a bed. So if there's an area that's just really got perennial weeds and somehow come back, we've kind of lost the ball a bit with those composted beds, like often happens in the busy season. Then we'll just for the next crop to go in there, we'll kind of just tarp it with those landscape membrane, and then we'll plant maybe some courgettes or plant some winter spinach into the holes in the membrane. So we're still cropping from that, and we've still got living roots. So the soil's not going to just like die underneath there. So we've still got something going on in that part of the market garden. Um, or sometimes also resetting a bed through a cover crop. So reset a bed through like buckwheat and phacelia. That's like a really amazing way to overcome some of those grasses. And often when you reset it, if you put a block into that for a year, the buckwheat is allelopathic to the couch grass, and you're feeding your soil, so you're allowing a bit, you're giving back a little bit to that market garden, and then you can kind of reset with the bed system the following season in that area. So various approaches, and it depends on your like spaces, your level of compost input, level of labor input, scale, and how much you need to supply from that area. If you really need to like try and get a full-time livelihood from quite a small plot of market garden, then maybe doing a bit more no dig and really focused high value crops, it'll probably be quite a good way forward. But probably beyond a certain size, quite good to consider potential like minimum tillage. Like we use our power harrow on the BCS, and we also use the rotavator on it. Um, in cultivation terms, it's still very minimal till compared to tractor work and things like that, and it's kind of a reset those beds. And we found the soil health is still increasing year on year, even with that kind of give and take approach of a bit of tillage and a bit of um, you know cropping, a bit of composting, and those sort of things. So yeah, that's the first thing to approach in this like design considerations is like what actually is our methodology and how can we make sure that's like the right one for this context, and how can we then apply that in a kind of straightforward standardized way so we know the system for this, it's clear, and it's we've got a strategy for each thing that might come up in terms of whether it's couch grass or like that block's not very productive, or all those different things. So that's really good to like define your approach. And then that does link in with like overall size and aims. So we kind of try and backcast from the the aims of what we need to be producing that year for the number of livelihoods. So overall as a business we do that. That's like the pattern economics. We look at the overall business. We're income aim for last year I think was £350,000, and that was more or less achieved. And then we kind of when we were doing the forecast, we kind of backtrack from there and we're like, okay, yeah, we need to be like growing this amount. We need to, X, Y, Z, which sounds quite an oversimplistic approach to sort of just backcast from what you need. But I think too often we'll as growers be in the kind of scarcity mindset of just like, what could we do with this tiny, bit of budget, and let's just see what we make from this bed. So instead we try and set the income aim. So we're like, okay, we know we need to earn £2,000 a week from wholesale. We know we need to earn £3,000 a week from veg boxes, and that will cover those wages. And we need to also set realistic targets about those incomes as well. And then there's a meeting point for that design consideration of size and aims. So that's really key. That's quite a big one, like the sort of size, aims, economics. And then from your approach and from what you need to grow will come your kind of bed size. So that's number 3, is like the bed size and how you standardize your like pattern approach for the market garden. So depending on the layout of your land, the contours, the overall like space that you're growing on, that bed size and standardization is really important. And to keep it standardized, just so like all the tools match. So our like 1.2 meter beds work really well because the griddler, which marks out our rows really nice and neatly, this big heavy metal roller thing that just marks out a grid. So we can have neat, easy hoeing. So that griddler is 60 centimeters. So we have to do 2 passes for one bed. And our tilther does a kind of 40 centimeter pass. So it's like 3 passes to do that bed. Is really quick. It's just a little electric drill powered tool that you just whiz along the bed. super quick and very minimal disturbance, just the top sort of 2 inches. And we know our hose are spaced at 15 centimeters and 30 centimeters, so we know that's just one gridless space or two gridless spaces. So it's like super simple to get to sort of see our market garden system, and kind of, we have trainee growers and people that come through the farm, and they'll come in and they'll see, once they've done a few bed plantings, they're like, oh, it's either this system spacing or that system spacing for bigger crops, and this is the weeding thing, and this is the bed prep process. So yeah, once those kind of beds are standardized, you can have those systems and tools and management sort of systematized as well. Number four is materials and inputs. So again, there's links to the other design considerations, but to what level you're buying in compost and labor inputs and time inputs and things like that as well. Number five is like management and maintenance plans. So yeah, looking at with your market garden design, looking at the spaces around the edges, like edge management is so important. Like that's where all the grasses, all the perennial weeds creep in. So if you've got a maintenance plan for that, it might be as simple, like on a small market garden, as just some green landscape membrane or something around the outside that directly, solarizes and blocks the light. So you're not going to have weeds growing on your edge and coming in. Or it might be like cardboard and wood chip for a really like nice, beautiful one, but then you will have to reset that most years. Or it might be that you cultivate the edges and then have some really beautiful wildflower strips that also have phacelia and buckwheat, which can kind of outcompete your grasses and just kind of provide a buffer to that edge. So the edge of your market garden kind of blocks as a whole is really, really key, because it's also where you're going to be, you interact with the edge. The mostly is where you're sort of wheelbarrowing, putting your crates, do it so you can have a neat edge and manage that edge and stop the kind of both the creep of weeds, but also the kind of that edge where it can get a bit messy. That's really key. And if you can get any reason, it's the width of the mower. All of those different considerations are really key. And that links to number six, which is kind of designing from a pattern approach and like kind of permaculture lens. So that's been really key to our design, is like looking at this block thing. We've got 9 blocks. Each block has X number of beds. Each bed is X size, and each first bed is a pollinator strip, for example. And all of these different design patterns are really important, because then it's well, maybe it's just good for the slightly more OCD mind, but also I think it's reassuring for the maintenance and management, and to make it all flow as easy as possible amidst the busy, chaotic season. Number seven is crops and functional diversity. So not trying to do everything and choosing what crops are really suitable for your land, which can take a bit of trial and error, but it's also got to bring in the economics of that and the ease of growing, and what just what the land responds well to, but also what your customers respond well to, and what's the functional diversity rather than just like maximizing diversity. Because actually ecosystems don't just maximize diversity forever. Ecosystems are like patterns. So like an oak savanna has a pattern, it has a family of oaks, it has a family of companion species for that. So we have to mimic that with a market garden and a farm, rather than just people like to grow 70 varieties of veg and they get excited and do their crop planning, but actually need to find a functional diversity, because then you can deepen those relationships with a smaller number of crops. Without taking that too far, you don't want to become a monocultural farm, because that's not ecosystem mimicry either. But if you can have a functional diversity, which will be different for every farm, but maybe it's like looking at your top 15 crops that are really focused crops, and you might still grow others on the side, but actually these are the ones that really work well for us, are really economic, are really going to generate a good livelihood from us, and we know we can sell plenty of. And there'll be all these different factors that will be unique to your context, which will mean you kind of have a crop like profitability index or a crop functionality index. So we do that for our crops. It's quite a bit of work at first, but I've also got the spreadsheet so I can share with you. But you input your sort of own numbers and metrics for that in terms of giving the crops a different rating. And that really, it means you can just put some data to your decisions, and it means you can put some information towards how you're deciding what to grow, and ultimately what you grow and how much of it, and the marketing for it will determine um the kind of income and the economics of it, and all of those things. So functional diversity and trying to optimize rather than just maximize. Number eight is water systems. So getting the irrigation right. A lot of time on farm, and growing products in market gardens is so water dependent, especially in changing climates and more extremes. So getting that water design right is so key. I remember in the early years we'd spend our kind of pie chart of labour of where we put our time. Like watering was quite a big one, weeding was quite a big one, and those were just big resource drains that we couldn't afford to like be paying ourselves to like water and weed that much. So we have to develop systems that can either automate that or kind of optimize it or make it really smooth and efficient, even in a changing climate. So um, now our pie chart of labor is much more like, harvesting is a huge one, than sales and packing and just direct sowing crops and quick bed flips and things. So all the things that are very highly productive, we need to be spending most of our day in the market garden doing those things to make it economic for the amount of labor input, which sounds a bit hard nosed, but it's sort of the reality of sort of thriving market gardens to make enough income. And some examples of water systems might be just small interventions, like things like, I don't know why it took us 3 or 4 years to get like irrigation timers for our polytunnels, just so we could have irrigation going at the right depth and the right time of day and all those sort of things, and getting the right moisture levels. And it was just automatic. It was done without us breaking a sweat or anything or turning on a tap. And it's a ridiculously small investment, like 40 or 50 quid from eBay. And well, a bit of systems and sprinklers and things, but we had all those already. So it's small little leverage points to really save yourself time. If that can save an hour every week for 10 years, and it's huge for the labour of the farm going forwards, and potentially gives you a more reliable supply as well. You've got to be careful because some of the overhead polytunnel sprinklers are a bit more like kind of irregular. So um, yeah, we're kind of looking to upgrade ours that will actually do a bit of a more even job for propagation, for example. And another water system example is with the standardization of your market garden blocks and beds, having a system where the irrigation system matches that. So, for example, our 9 market garden blocks, which I mentioned, they're all, I think, 25 by 25 meters when you include the paths and the edges. One of our sprinklers, we've designed the pressure and the piping and the sprinkler head so that it does a 25 by 25 meter block. And we can put that on a timer if we need, or we can move it between the blocks if we've only got one of them, or we can have one per block and set them on a timer. We haven't actually finished setting that timer system up because it kind of changes a bit different weeks. Some heat waves will need a little bit more, so we can just click the sprinkler in and that'll water the block and give it a really good soak. So it's minimizing all those water movements, moving hoses, constant stuff, even little stuff that adds up, on a day to day, that will really add a lot in the long term and kind of make quite a difference between the kind of make and break of that profit and loss and kind of income generation and livelihoods over time. And finally, number 9 for design considerations is access and workflow. So number 1, access is all about not just thinking about like your delivery vehicles and your efficiency of movements with your harvest crates and your harvest trailers and things like that, but also looking at the access to each individual bed, and making the path width is the same width as our crates, for example, so it's all 40 centimeters, and the access for like wheelbarrows or the access for the BCS 2-wheel tractor to turn around really simply and smoothly and prep the next bed. So looking at all of your access flows and like the desire lines on a farm of like where people actually use access and where you've made access paths can be quite different. So it's like looking at where that desire path lies. And then the workflow is like thinking about in the design of the market garden or in the redesign sometimes, because we've got our original designs wrong lots of times. So in that redesign process, looking at like the workflow, if you like, put yourself in the shoes of a salad or a lettuce and be like, okay, what's my journey from field to fork, and trying to get that workflow really smooth, or even go back to the seed and say, what's my journey from seed? Are there ways that we can minimize labor and kind of optimize and really value our time in each of those stages of the process? So that journey of that lettuce seed, where is the seed stored in relation to the polytunnel and to the cropping calendar and to the seeding lists, and Then in the propagation space, what's the workflow process? Like how far away is the propagation compost from the place you need it? And can you just get the pallet of propagation compost to be dropped off right where you need it? And all these different mini micro workflow things. And then when you're actually harvesting, what's the workflow for that crop through the washing station, the pack station, the crates, the bagging, the cooler, the delivery bike, or the van. Sort of design that workflow and that pattern, and yeah, kind of make sure that's like functioning as much as possible. Is really key in the design considerations. And there's loads more as well. There's like many more design considerations. Um, but we'll move on. There's a bit of like, protected cropping. There's like standardizing your enviromesh lengths and yeah, plant spacings, all those sort of things. But I'd say these are the kind of top ones that kind of focus on in order of like kind of designing your things in order of permanence. So the really permanent stuff, like your where you're going to put those, whether it's perennial crops or where you're going to put the polytunnels and all those permanent things, working on first and then working back through the order in that pattern design. Um, any questions or comments or anything on that sort of section? Great. I can't actually see the chat when I'm sharing screen, so if there is anything in there, then maybe someone can shout it out or something. Um,
I did have a question.
yeah, go for it.
I did have a couple of questions on this. So I was just wondering if you're still doing boxes only 7 months a year, or if you've gone to year round.
Oh no, we went to year round years ago. Yes, I wish we did it in the first year. It was just necessary for year round livelihoods. So yeah, we did the 7 month a year for the first year or two, but then we shifted to year round. Yeah, probably in 2022 or 2021. Yeah. Oh, I think you just froze on my screen, Athene, so I didn't.
Wondering what your what make it is, or where you get it from.
Oh, can you ask that one again?
I
The
was just
screen
wondering,
lag.
can you hear me?
Yes, that's all good now.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I was just wondering about your tarp that you use, what it is specifically, and where
Uh,
you get it from.
yeah, it's so there's a few different types. You want to focus on the weight and things. So I think we just get ours from ProTech, PROTEC, and there's lots of similar ones available. I think that's the actual manufacturer of them, so we can get them a bit cheaper and buy them in quite big rolls, and that was a good initial investment. If you think of the amount of weeding and time and things, just resetting one block a year if Market Garden can do is amazing. So we kind of tend to rotate it around the blocks. So we've only usually got one or two problem blocks each year, so we can kind of just kick that can down the road and tarp them, which is great. And it's important, I think, to get the heavier ones. The light ones just seem to fray a little bit. So I think there's like 100 GSM, grams per square meter, and 130 GSM, and there might even be a 140 or 150. So I'd say if you can, if budget allows, go for the heaviest because it'll just last for years longer and you won't get plastic bits coming out. And the dark green one's just nice for aesthetics and similar costs. So go for that one. Cool. So I do a little bit on market garden setup, if that's useful for you guys. And it might apply to like the annual reset as well. So hopefully, even if you've got established market gardens, it'll be useful. Um, and then we'll do a little bit on like infrastructure tools, and then it'll be kind of over to a bit more into some of the economics. So my sort of recommendations from starting lots of market gardens, starting lots of them in non-ideal ways and making lots of mistakes, but also starting some market gardens that turned out to be very beautiful and productive. I guess what I've learned from my context at least is it's ideal if you can have a bit of a lag time before setting up the market garden. So if you can have time to like cover crop that land first, depending on its previous use. Like if it's some plots are really good shape, ready to go, great organic matter, low weeds, but I haven't come across that many of them. So most plots, especially if you're going into grass or you're going into like a horse paddock or you're going into even in some arable land that's got its own kind of annual weed issues, if you can cover crop for a year before that. So if you can say in May or June, you can sow your Phacelia and buckwheat combination, maybe even a mix of others like a bit more diversity in the cover crops always good because they all serve different functions, like the clover for nitrogen, the ryegrass for a bit more organic matter, and chicory for deep rooting. Um, use what you need in response to your land. But ideally, if you can cover crop that land first, you can get it in much better shape to be, cultivated or beds made the following year for market garden. And I appreciate you might not always have the luxury of time for that. So um, potentially cultivating and then cover crop in a certain area whilst doing some no dig cardboard compost beds to get you going is another option. So kind of doing a bit of a mixture. Or some people just like tarp the whole area, especially if it's a smaller market garden. If you can just tarp it for 12 months, um, then there's effectively that's a no chemical way to transition from grass to a really clean bed, basically. So that's also, recommended in some contexts just to tarp it and come back to a nice clean bed. Um, but if you don't have that kind of luxury of time, then I'd recommend like you could either like mow the grasses down and then lay really thick cardboard and then like build up your market garden beds. Or you could also like cultivate a little bit to like get the bed in shape. So cultivate, try and overcome the grasses, maybe a shallow plough and then a power harrow, and then lay some cardboard rolls down. You can get these big rolls that you just roll out and you can make a bed really quickly because you've got a huge roll of cardboard that's much quicker than little bits and odds and sods. So you could cultivate a little bit first because that just knocks back the grasses and then to cardboard and compost. Um, but if the grass is not like too kind of invasive or perennial weedy and you don't want to disturb the soil at all, then you could just like mow and then cardboard and compost. We've done like both and there's not much in it. It's probably different in different contexts, but they both work quite well. If you're short on time and you can't do the full cover cropping or tarping for a whole year. Um, and then I'd say if depending on your scale, like if you're setting up a market garden any more than like half an acre or so, then I'd really recommend getting a bit of equipment help. We've actually made most of our market garden by hand, but so this is coming from that, and I think it was only towards the end of it we were like, oh right, now we've got a tractor with a front loader and a neighbour with a front loader, and we can make these beds really quite quickly. Obviously, it comes off with the trade-off of like a bit of ground compaction, a bit of machinery use, a bit of fossil fuel use, but I think it's a really worthwhile investment when you can make a market garden in a day or two through those methods. You can hire these things for a lot cheaper than it would be for you to wheelbarrow all winter. As much as I actually genuinely love wheelbarrow and compost. But yeah, so different methods basically for that. And we kind of use these like wooden frames first to like make a really nice, neat garden. Like having those wooden frames is great because you've got the same depth, you've got the right width. We just made really big frames that were it was like half a bed, so it was like 10 meters by 1.2. Fill the frames with compost, get it all level with the back of a rake just across the top of the frame, fill the sides with wood chip, and then move on to the next. That's what I'd recommend for like the no dig ones. We have a slightly simpler system now where it's just two string lines that go along the edge, and the two string lines are 1.2 meters apart with a block of wood at either end. So it's really simple. It's just a roll out string line, you have your bed, and it just gives you the width. So the frames have the benefit of giving you the depth and making it really neat. Whereas we do a slightly quicker approach now and we just use those string lines and then we just chuck loads of compost in that area. If we're doing like a salad block, for example, we'll prep that. And that's really it. And then you just rake it along, move to the next bed, and then plant up the garden. And the early years of those like new fresh beds, if done well, can be really just amazing because the plants are just feeding off that really fresh compost and kind of fresh uncultivated soil. We tend to get council waste compost, so actually it's not the best compost biologically. It's actually pretty biologically dead, but it's £10 a ton, and we can inoculate it with. We can let it rot down for 6 months or a year, and we can inoculate it with worm castings. We can put our compost teas on. We can put on these kind of like microbe. You can actually get these microbe things from Soil Ecology Lab, which will have all of the diverse kind of soil life and fungal and nematodes and protozoa and everything that you need for that compost. So, or you can brew that in your own, um, you know, compost tea brews or compost heaps and things like that. So inoculating that kind of quite dead but cheap council composts and green waste with some really good stuff to make sure your market gardens got off to a good start is really important. And the wood chip halves are beautiful, but they're actually very practical. So they actually bring the mycorrhizal fungi in. They bring in a lot for water retention, often like bringing a lot of like worm food and carbon rich material, and they kind of shift your field from very like bacterial dominated, which pastures are often very bacterial dominated. They're not really ready for veg. So the things like the wood chip will really get that ground ready for veg crops, basically. So that's a bit of process for setup. And then in terms of infrastructure, these are the kind of bare basics. And again, just thinking about that workflow, thinking about your day-to-day efficiency when designing these spaces or when redesigning them, all of those little micro movements on the day-to-day really make a huge difference, like how far you're walking each day to get the um whatever it is, the harvest crates, and then the knives are over there and the sewing calendars here. So trying to really optimize and redesign, and not being afraid to just sort of like speak out for that design, the needs for that redesign. Operation space first and foremost, so having some sort of pack shed, wash, process, pack, store. Storage is like so important to get like the if you can be have that really good secure storage, then it takes the pressure off like having to just continually how you can always be advanced, you can always be one step ahead of yourself if you've got really good storage and cold storage. And you can make it modular. We got like an old Tesco chiller on a trailer, and it was like 50 quid. And then we spent a bit of money getting the air conditioning units running again and things like that. So it's probably another 2 grand of investment. But it still saved us like 10 grand of buying a new cooler chiller. And it's a really big chiller, and it's movable, it's modular, it's movable, so it's resellable, etc., etc. So it's a really good asset and way to do cool space. Another way is to like get a fridge fan, because then you've got a delivery vehicle and a fridge fan that we can plug into our solar, and it's obviously movable. It expands our cold space, but also means we've got a delivery vehicle as well. So it's kind of, we needed both of those investments a couple of years ago, so we just decided to combine that into one. And then protected cropping, so tunnels, or greenhouses. Greenhouses are a bigger startup investment. Polytunnels are a bit quicker, but less quality. Like greenhouses, you can get much more year-round cropping. You can have much better propagation. You can start a bit earlier, and they can have a lot of benefits. They're kind of like less peaks and troughs. Like polytunnels can get really over hot, and then plants can get damaged, and then they can go really cold overnight because they're not very insulated. Whereas greenhouses are a bit more steady. So various pros and cons of that protected cropping. There's also like low tunnels, caterpillar tunnels, cloches. The Elliot Coleman book's got amazing examples of really good like modular things for like shade cloths, windbreaks, cloches, kind of winter low tunnels, which are really low cost but extend your season hugely. We've still got outdoor salad we're harvesting. And I think, it just helps to have those, like, we actually just enviromesh some stuff over winter just because it gives it a layer of protection from the frost, like little hoops into the ground, old bits of irrigation pipe, and then enviromesh over the top of that, maybe even 2 layers of enviromesh. And you've got yourself a little blanket for the crops just for those frosty weeks. And you can suddenly be harvesting thousands of pounds more salad than you would have been without that additional protection. And it's largely, sometimes it's largely wind protection is a huge one that people often underestimate. And finally, like site infrastructure and utilities and like your deer fencing, or other alternatives to keeping all the pests out, and the water and electrics design, and all the things like that as well. And then in terms of tools, so as I've mentioned, the kind of market garden processing systems can be really quite efficient, because you can have a really small number of hand tools that you get to know really well, and you can kind of develop a craft for and really hone your skills on them. but they're just really accessible and easy to use. And you could just grab them all in a wheelbarrow and do all your bed prep and do 10 beds at a time. And you flipped, a bed every 10 minutes and it's great and really quick. And that's the ideal system if you can get to that through your tools design and through the market garden beds design and have a really organized workflow and process for that, then that's the kind of gold standard. I've learned a lot from Ben Hartman's book, The Lean Farm, and lots of his videos about that kind of lean farming approach. Not kind of, again, not maximizing, but trying to optimize. So have things like, rather than a million different types of hose and all this thing, try and just have like one that you can get to know really well that's for small, dense spacing plants, like 15 centimeters, and one for your bigger plants, and maybe a wheel hoe or something like that. Um, and same for all the other things, even just for like crates, I have them all the same and stackable rather than so many other different types. Keep it all like to standardized systems, and that kind of lean farming approach will work wonders for you, and it will mean you just value your body and your time and put in a lot less kind of repeat effort into the same things. Um, and we kind of organize, this is our tool board from a few years ago. So we organize it in process of when those tools are needed. So there's number one is like bed prep tools. So we've got our tilther, which is the one on the left with the sort of V shape handles. And that's like a solar powered, well, we charge our batteries off the solar, and then it's a little drill battery and it just creates a tilth on the top 2 inches of soil so we can seed a crop into it really smoothly. And it breaks up the clumps of like council waste compost as well. So we have like bed prep tools, including the rake. It's really simple actually. When the beds are nice and clean and easy, the bed prep tools can be as simple as that. Sometimes we'll use the flail mower on the BCS as well to prep the bed and just terminate the old crop. And then the second one is bed sowing or planting. So that's seeders like a Jang seeder or an Earthway seeder. The latter, the Earthway seeder, is much cheaper and actually really effective and really good. So I'd probably recommend that. The Jang seeder is a bit more particular. Does a bit better, like in terms of it's got the roller and it's got more specific spacing, so it's a bit more high tech. But actually, in practice, that doesn't always seem to work that well on our soil. So maybe that's probably why I'm favourable to the Earthway. And the Earthway is much better for bigger seeds as well, like spinach, beetroot family, and yeah, beans and things like that. So that's the bed sewing tool. So we keep that in one section. So we know if we're going to go to a job, we can just go to like, okay, I'm doing bed prep, so I can just go and grab the tools from that, and then get off and do it really efficiently, put them back in the same place. And importantly, they've all got a label because otherwise, just the day to day of tools management and losing things and finding things adds up to a lot of time and makes it a lot less economic. And then number three is kind of bed management tools. So that's all the hose, the forks to do the composting, the all the other things like that. And then there's also harvest tools, and really like optimizing the right harvest tool and process and technique for each job. So we have quite different. I'll use a sort of smaller Opinel knife for salads to lots of quick cut, small leaf stuff like that, and then I have a really large knife for cabbage, which is sort of more of a push knife, and a sort of medium knife for just harvesting greens and spinach and things. Because when we try and aim to put most of our labour into like that harvesting and making the harvesting really efficient, so that's really key. And there's a few different techniques with the harvesting just to like really nail, like if you can really nail the greens harvest and hone that technique, and then you can really nail the roots and the bunching technique and the fruits and squash, beans, courgettes. If you can really, it might seem simple, it's just like, I'll go and get a crop, but actually a bean harvest can take all day or it can take half an hour, and a bed of salad can similarly be really quick or it can take all day, and it's often a thing of mindset and how much we're thinking or overthinking, and it's often a thing of like honing and developing a technique over time, which does just take practice, and it takes doing a lot of big harvests and then just repetition, and then seeing how you can continuously improve, and then every week if you get a tiny bit better at that harvest, then it adds up to a lot over the years. Yeah, that's the basic tools, and then obviously like appropriate machinery if you're at that scale where you need that, so a two-wheel tractor or a compact tractor or a bigger tractor with a loader and a transplanter if you want to sort of do it really low labor and slightly different scale. It's really good to consider that. Reag Tools is great because it's like the sort of UK supplier of lots of market garden tools, and it's got the kind of breakdown of those tools in their categories. So if you need a bed prep tool, you can go to that category on the page. So it's quite good education material as well. Um, and I think we've gone over most of these. But yeah, just kind of techniques, initial bed making, bed maintenance, planting and seedling. So having a clear method and strategy on the market garden for transplanting, and your spacing, so it's all really clear for anyone, for yourself or anyone working there. And then direct seeding. There's obviously benefits to both. We kind of try and direct seed just over half our crops, and we transplant the rest. So we tend to, the general rule of thumb is we kind of transplant the bigger plants, that really help to have had that establishment from propagation and that kind of a bit more tender care. So things like spinach, brassicas, squash, beans, we try and propagate them first, or we buy them from Delftland because they're always really good quality and it saves us polytunnel space. Um, and then kind of the rest we direct seed because you want to like maximize your time efficiency. And if you can get nice clean beds, then the direct seed is just so great because the labor of sowing, watering, caring for, planting out, griddling, doing all of that versus just like pushing a seeder over a bed, like for radish, is so different. So I'd really consider like trying to shift the market garden towards more direct seeding where possible. Obviously, if you're in a different situation where you've got like much more weeds, and it's a different system, maybe it's like tractor weeded and transplanted, then you might want to do more transplants. But I'd say for a lot of market garden systems, it's really better to spend more time getting those beds really good and composted and less weedy, and then being able to direct seed in the busy season. We even do like direct seed, a lot of chard and beetroot, spring onion, carrots, all of the usual ones as well. And yeah, it just works great. A lot of salads as well. Direct seed like a sort of Tamar salad mix, and it just comes up to really nice, beautiful, clean beds. So that's key, just to get those techniques and processes for those planting and seeding. And then bed flip, I'd say that's one of the most key ones because the rate at which you can flip a bed from harvest, from point of harvest. So say in the morning we're harvesting all of our pak choi heads for the veg boxes. Ideally, we want to be in the market garden if we're trying to make it really economic. We want to be like continuous cropping, and we give a lot to the soil, and the soil health's improving. But there's also a lot that comes out of that. So we're kind of continuous cropping. Sometimes that's with cover crops or living pathways, but we're trying to keep continuous roots in the ground, not really have bare soil or empty beds or like half harvested beds or things. So we try and maximize, for example, like a pak choi bed, we'll harvest those 200 pak choi, go out in the veg boxes, and then we can flip that bed, um, in a matter of less than an hour and have it re-sown with something, and then you're like ready for the next thing. So you have to like kind of always have that mindset of almost always watching out for the empty space and continuously cropping those crops. Some places, sometimes we'll just have like the spinach will be in the ground for most of the year and it's cut and come again. And because the soil health's really good, we can get loads of harvest from that. Sometimes we can have 5 really good cuts before we terminate that bed and flip it into another crop. Same with a lot of cut and come again salads. Same with like the bean crops and the courgettes, they'll kind of stay in there for a longer season. And then over winter we'll just try and fill all the space over winter with like perpetual spinach, hardy mustard, salads, overwintering garlic, peas and broad beans, and we'll just try and get the winter market garden really quite full as well. So we've still got a pretty full market garden, and we're still getting a good amount of income at this time of year from that, which is really good. I mean, it's a lot less than summer, but it really helps. And it requires like the winter growing starts in June and July, so you have to like requires flipping those beds quite quickly in a busy season. So that's why the bed flip's so key to get right. So for example, for the pak choi example, what we would do for a bed flip is number one, we'd flail mow because pak choi is quite a sensitive crop, so you can actually terminate it by a flail mow with a BCS. So we'd flail mow that pak choi bed, and sometimes that'll be enough to kill off the crop if you can do a mow really low to the ground with a BCS, almost touching the soil or pretty much touching it. That'll be enough to kind of terminate that pak choi bed. And the flail mow will just make a mulch of lovely green pak choi mush, which is really lovely just to plant into, or you can direct seed through it. It's not like a big smoothie mush. It's just like a very thin scattering of wood chip. Call it ramial pak choi flailing. And then you can direct sow into it with like the next crop, which might be I don't know, radish or spring onions, for example. Or it might be you're not going to plant into it straight away. You might just tarp it and let that crop die off, and then it's nice and weed free for when you need it in 2 weeks. So like try and do the bed prep in advance, if not immediately. It's really good to flip those beds quickly, and it means you're constantly putting back into the soil and the living roots. And in terms of other techniques, as I mentioned, there's harvesting process, trying to learn 3 key techniques, and there's the pre and post harvest workflow. So yeah, making sure before the harvest you've got it all organized, all the lists, you've got everything you need for that harvest to go really smoothly. That makes a huge, huge difference, especially now. This season where someone's harvesting for like 3 grand of wholesale orders on a Monday, and then we're doing all the veg box stuff and like huge, huge harvest. So we've had to rapidly upgrade our systems and been chasing our tail a bit to kind of get all of those things in place. So we've just got all the crate numbers. We've already got 20 crates laid out. That's for spinach, and that just needs to be set off and done. And we've got the crates for salad, and then we've got the process after where they're going and the bagging and the workflow. And then the post harvest for your beds. So if you've which we don't do loads of actually, but I think a little bit of that post harvest bed maintenance is really good. Like if you've harvested all the spinach in the polytunnel, if there's time later in the day to like just rake it over, get all the loose leaves out, maybe a quick hoe down the pathways to make sure the edge is maintained again, and then it's really easy and ready for the next harvest. And the way that you've harvested, make sure it's left in a good state for the next harvest. Like the spinach, there's a very optimum point to cut the spinach up the plant. It's usually sort of 3 inches above it, and then that will leave a little mini crown for that perpetual spinach, the next crop, your kind of second cut, to grow back sometimes twice as quick as if you cut it too low. I've experienced it will grow back quite slowly, and if you cut it too high, then it will grow back really stalky and messy, and you have rotten bits, and there'll be disease. And so there's a sweet spot, and it's different for different plants, and depends on how clean your beds are and how weedy, what the optimum height is as well. Um, so bed flip. So I went through the pak choi example, but some crops are a bit more tricky than that. Like perpetual spinach is really quite deeply rooted, so it's not as simple as just mow it and plant into it, of course. So for those crops, it depends what's coming next in that cropping cycle. So if we want to reset that bed for a winter planting of garlic, I might mow down that perpetual spinach block, and then I might do a light cultivation with the BCS rotavator, and then I might put a tarp over it, and then put the wintering garlic in the tarp holes, for example. Or if we've got a bit more time, and maybe it's the springtime, we're getting rid of our old chard crop, I might mow that chard crop down. We don't remove plants from the bed because that's taking away its fertility, and it's a lot of labour moving it to the compost pile and then back again and all of that. So we try and keep it in the ground with mowing or with tarping, and that seems to really help the soil health a lot. It's basically making compost in situ. So we might mow that chard bed, and then maybe cardboard and compost over the top, because maybe it's got salad going in next after that chard. So we want to make it a really clean, really beautiful, really productive bed. So the bed flip, we've got a few different options, and it will depend on what's coming next and things like that, basically. And I won't go into harvesting in loads of detail because that's one to be more practically demonstrated and just is practice, practice, practice. But I say the key thing to that is like this Kaizen approach. So I think we sort of touched on it already, but this thing of continuous improvement. And it's just all about those kind of micro movements, like harvesting position, how close the crate is to where you're harvesting, all these like micro efficiencies, sharp tools like can harvest, 20% quicker sometimes with a good tool. And it can be a much better quality crop, and the regrowth can be quicker from a sharp tool harvest. So it's really interesting how the plants respond to that, and disease and pest issues and things like that. And I think like harvesting as meditation is, well, my personal approach in terms of quite an active meditation, but like if I'm lost in my mind or thinking or chatting too much or things like that, then the harvests can be a very different experience. And actually, I love the focused harvest. It can be the best. It's like going on a cycle ride or something. It's just the processing for the mind and all those things. And I tend to say we've got like more like newer growers and stuff, then like it's good, yeah, like to really have that focus time and a bit of like solo time on harvesting or quiet time on harvesting, something that can be really good just to do a big harvest and to really get to grips with like the micro movements and the different things like that. And then obviously as we get a bit more experience with the harvesting and stuff, then there's it's more easy just to chat and do other things and think about the business plan whilst doing it. But I think especially for those early years, I'd personally opt for like very focused harvesting. Um, cool. That's a whistle stop tour of bit of like growing tips, and again take it all with a pinch of salt because it's like our context and work out what works best for you, but hopefully some of like the underlying approach and mindset and I guess kind of like philosophy around it helps as well. But really bringing in the economics to this kind of segues to the next section, but bringing in the economics to the pattern and your kind of overall business, but then to like the nerdy detail of like, is this carrot bed viable? This process I'm doing, the bed flip and the time and energy put into it and the weeding, like, oh, I'm only getting £100 yield from those carrots. So can I put in, if I put in like more than a couple of hours, it's probably already lost. So yeah, looking at the microeconomics as well as the macro is probably the key takeaway from that section. Yeah, any questions or thoughts on that section before we go into a little bit of economics and then we'll do sort of questions and close after that. Hmm. Cool, awesome. We've got a little there's like a little crop profitability index and sort of activity I'm going to share in a moment as well, to find out what your most profitable crops are. Um, and yeah, the way I sort of like look at the market garden economics, like we do sort of more like longer day workshops on this because I think it's really, really key, both for the wider business and the farm, but also for that detail level of the market gardening. So my approach is a very permacultural one. It's kind of from pattern to detail and viewing economics from that very holistic lens, which we sort of touched on at the start. But I think as a skill and a mindset of really zooming in and out. I remember I studied economics at uni. That was sort of my background. I didn't quite realize how it would segue so well with farming, but actually ended up being quite useful. But you don't need like uni training for this. It's kind of like farming is economic. Farming is a lesson and an education in economics. There's like day to day stuff. It's all about value flows, and there's micro and macroeconomics, but you can apply that just to a farm of like looking at the detail, and then zooming out to like the overall business inputs and labor budgets and profitability, and then zooming right back into like, yeah, is this salad bed, optimized and viable and things like that. It's just like asking those like realistic and reflective questions, and the aim is not to be like judgmental or thinking like, oh, I'm not making money from that bed, so this is not working, or it's because of me, or because of the team, or because of the land or the soil. It's like it's actually just because of this learning journey and constantly refining it to be like valuing our own time and valuing our own kind of bodies and labor to be like, oh, if we can optimize this a bit more, then that makes it a bit less of a struggle, or it makes it maybe even a thriving livelihood in a few years, or maybe just share some learning for the next phase of this growing project. So just asking continually those questions, and also caveating that and acknowledging that we're in these huge economic system crises for horticulture, and it's really tricky because food prices are rock bottom, and that's the real systemic issue. But it will take a while to change that system, and we can work on that. And in the meantime, we need to like make sure we can thrive as much as possible, and we're also more likely to shift towards those regenerative food systems if we prove the economic models, or if we at least hang in there to for when those food system shifts and collapses and transformations occur. Slight tangential systemic shifts, but the economics of the market garden. So we start from the pattern level, and then we'll zoom in a bit to the detail. This might be very basic and teaching a grandmother to suck eggs, but looking at kind of like income flows, outgoing flows, is the key thing to the pattern analysis. So you can look at broader pattern and like profit and loss sheets and what your overall labor budget is and all of that. And then there's another pattern level, which is your kind of like looking at your weekly income. I find like looking on a week to week basis is really much more approachable than like profit and loss sheets or all of this. So looking at like in our average week, how much outgoing costs have we got for this week? So that's looking at averaged costs rather than like how much did I spend this week or what's like just gone out of the bank transaction. So this is a metric to develop if we are like over the whole course of the year profitable, but looking at this individual week. Um, and yeah, it's as simple as like each week. Again, this comes from like harvesting a bit of data over the years. So you need to know your numbers and have those income things recorded, like for example, through a software like Xero or through very good bookkeeping. So you know like what those income figures are and what those outgoing costs and overheads are. So to take a very simple example, I think this is from last year or so. It's a bit different now, but each week, last year we earned an average of 3,000 from veg boxes, 1,800 from wholesale. So our total inflow is 4,800, and that's the average. So it might be a little bit more in summer, a little bit less in winter, but we have stabilized that over time, so it's not as huge a vast difference because we keep all our staff on year-round living wage. So it's we've tried to really even that out a lot through the year, and the veg box income helps with that. So that's our weekly inflow, 4,800 each week. At that point, we were employing 20 days labour. Average cost of £100 a day, so £2,000 cost. So labour is the biggest cost. It's usually about half. So if you depends on your business, but for us it's about half the cost. So if you're looking at the microeconomics of like a bed of carrots, if you know that labour is about half of your cost, so you say, okay, so the labour it takes me for this bed of carrots from seed to harvest to prep and sale is like 3 hours for that bed, for example, then you can estimate. You can say, okay, so the overall cost of that bed might be about double that 3 hours. So it might be £90 or something. So then you can begin to just think about those different metrics. Like, okay, that means that bed of carrots needs to be generating this much. Otherwise, it's probably not viable, and we need to like redesign that bed, or have a slightly different growing system, or just shift in that direction, or higher value crop, or put our prices up, just to make sure it covers your base load. So that's the labor cost, the biggest cost. And then there's all these other costs. There's like so many overheads all add up, so many growing costs, operational costs, utilities, water, seed, plants, all these costs that are, inputs and stuff that are going up and up and up, whilst food prices stay the same. But anyway, so all of those costs for us last year in this example were £1,900. So actually similar to the labour amount. So it's a huge amount. So our total outflow was £3,900. That was like the average per week. So that left an average income flow of £900. So when we did this kind of like weekly weekly income outflow analysis sort of thing, when we did that a few years ago, when we were not quite at the viable point, we'd have an average. That would be a red box. So we'd have an average income of minus £50 or minus £100, and sometimes it was just very marginal. So those like tiny detail economics come into play quite a lot, because that difference between like, oh, I'm minus £50 this week versus minus plus 50, suddenly that's like a loss of £3,000 over the year versus a profit of £3,000 over the year. So the level of that we can reinvest in wages and into the business is very different at the end of the year, even just for a small difference of like a few hours labor a week, or this extra cost, or this cheaper packaging, or so all those little details matter basically. And that's the kind of weekly income outgoing analysis. And that's a very simplified example, but hopefully it helps, because once you've got that data of your average weekly cost, average weekly income, you can start to think, okay, so that means we've probably actually only got a labour budget of 4 full-time equivalent rather than 5 or something. And it's good to know those things before you hire people, So yeah, try and work out those numbers, and then try and over time, you won't be able to shift them overnight or just be like, oh, well, I want an inflow of £500, so I'm going to change it. It's got to like shift those systems and optimize over time, and maybe over a few years that does shift. So yeah, there's some of those sort of key variables, I guess, for like to optimize those farm and growing systems. And from that kind of pattern to detail economics, I guess these are the kind of like the key, top 8 points or something in terms of a summary of what we've spoken about already. In terms of like labor approach is almost like is number one for me. It's like right up there is how we sort of like day-to-day labor split, what we're putting our time into. That's usually the difference I can see if I go to a visit a farm and if like 40% of the time is on weeding, 20% is on watering, 20% is on setting up some beds, and then like 20% on harvest, and like I know instantly it's probably not viable. Whereas if I go to farm, like there's just constantly harvesting and direct seeding, and there's just it directs that directness. It doesn't mean it's like frantic and overworking. Actually, often those farms are calmer because they're sort of a bit more income generating. But if I can see that labour split because of the design and because of the systems and because of the market garden approach, then I can almost guarantee that farm's going to be quite economic when I sort of go to visit it. And obviously, many farms are not economic just because they're also not getting enough money for their food and not pricing and just the costs of growing are huge and all of those other factors as well. Um, but these are some of the other factors that helps to make it sort of work better in the meantime. So things like the productive use of space, really designing that space well from the detail level, workflow and efficiency, obviously minimizing inputs and overheads. So like all that we can cut down on that. So we've invested heavily in our spring water cyclical system, so we can have free water forever. We've invested heavily in solar powered energy, so we can like charge our delivery bikes. We can plug in the van cooler. We can charge the battery powered tools. We can run it all basically from that sunlight free energy. But obviously, those costs that require startup costs. So you need to like have faith in the vision and mission and business plan, and then either borrow money or crowdfund or do things to get the startup really as optimal as possible, and just sort of back yourself for that. And then I've also touched on like the lean farm approach. So that's like one of the key ones right up there, like develop that lean farm mentality. And then it can lead to a much more organized, grounded workspace, which of course will still have its challenges and summer chaos and things will go wrong and irrigation will break. But if you can minimize, there's enough things to think about. So if you can at least reduce the variables in farming and growing, it's great. Obviously, like the custom side, we haven't talked about today, but that's a whole separate thing. Is like, yeah, to optimize and make that market gardening profitable, you've got to like develop those markets, do the marketing, get support with that, develop the sort of business brand identity, all of those things that we don't want to do as growers, but maybe there's ways to collaborate as growers to supply joint markets, develop food hubs, or get marketing support, or learn from each other about those things, or supply each other and things like that. So there's, yeah, the committed and loyal customer base, and like if you can get to a position where you can just grow as much as possible of your functional, profitable crops, then you'll be in a really good stead to sort of make enough money that year. Because often farms and growers are like amazing at the growing. And they're growing loads of crops, but they just like gets to the August and they just can't sell enough because, well, partly everyone's on holiday and partly just that's the time when lots of crops all at once. So it's like staggering that growing, staggering the income, and making sure all those outlets and markets are kind of there, which is easier said than done, of course. And this is just a little diagram to demonstrate that labor split. So this is like one scenario of like labor split on a market garden. This is probably where we were at a few years ago, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. We were putting a lot of time into weeding, propagation, quite manual systems for that. Quick tip on that. There's a little hand seeder you can just get. I think it's on Reag Tools or somewhere else, but it's like a little push seeder that you can sow a seed tray in, seconds you can sow that whole seed tray. It's great. Little top tip aside, but that saved us hours every week. So that little hours every week adds up to that extra kind of margin. At this point in our growing journey a few years ago, we were putting only a 15% maybe into harvest and sales, so we weren't really that viable. We were putting a lot more time into bed prep because we hadn't really developed the systems. We hadn't like just done simple things like get the compost dropped off right where we need it. There's a lot of manual handling and things like that. So that was when we sort of weren't that viable. And this is very approximately like where we're trying to be a lot of the time. And this is the sort of point at which it becomes really, really viable and workable. If we spend like more than a general rule of thumb, for me at least, and in our context, is like more than half your time harvesting and sales in terms of all your labor on the farm. So for like the market garden, that applies, or for like a bigger farm and veg box business, that applies even more because there's a lot more customers and deliveries and sales and a lot of workload with that. So I'd say, again, it might be different in different contexts, but this is my kind of a simplification rule of thumb: at least half the time on harvesting and sales. Um, and to get to that point, you need to be in a point of like developing the low input, low labor systems for the market gardening. Um, yeah, focusing that labor approach, doing the training, doing all the stuff, like having that Kaizen um, sort of mentality, and also all the marketing to mean that you're spending that time harvesting and selling it and selling it at a proper price, which gives you a livelihood and sort of obtains that yield as well. Um, and yeah, so we've kind of through that, you can look at it as increasing the harvest time, or you can look at it as minimizing the other time. So we've massively reduced our amount of time on polytunnels and propagation because we've got the irrigation timers, we've got no dig, quite low weed beds and tunnels, quite efficient processes for whether it's pruning or picking, things like that. Massively minimized our weeding time through a bit cleverer use of different tools, through using the tarps when we need to, through the composted beds in the salads, through having really easy hoeing width apart spacings. And you'll notice there's a new category in this one that it wasn't in the other one. There's a 10% other. And I think you've got to always build that into market gardens, like a buffer, because because we factor in this labor and we're like, okay, we've got Mondays to harvest, we've got Thursdays for veg boxes, we've got Tuesdays for deliveries. And then there's no time for that buffer of like when something goes wrong or shit hits the fan, or you need to crop plan, or you need to have a team meeting, or you need to do all these other things. So trying to factor in that other time, or play the guitar on the porch, or bounce on the trampoline, is the sort of the quality of life aims, the market garden balance. Um, anyway, yeah. So I've only got a little bit of the more like presentation side left, but this is the um, a kind of like activity process. We've got many like tools that are similar to this, which I kind of recommend to lots of growers. But like developing your crop profitability index, I'd say, is really key. And it sounds a bit technical, but actually it's quite a fun process. And it's just like thinking about your crops a bit like the crop plan, but just adding the economic element in. I think a lot of growers and farms will do a crop plan, but without the information needed to decide on those crops for the business or for like the viability of it. So again, you need the data to actually make those decisions. So we've kind of done this for all of our crops, like looking at it's kind of a metric that just combines things like variables for market gardening, things like days to maturity, the yield, the sales value, other variables, and that kind of gives us like a score for each crop. So we might get, um, 12 for lettuce, 15 for radishes. That's quite high. So radishes must be one of our top economic crops. We're quite low, like parsnips are only a 6. So we have to like then look at, okay, what's the threshold whereby we cut off that plant? So where we just like ruthlessly say, actually, maybe we shouldn't grow that because we're losing money on it. So you can do that by actually working out the cost of that bed, but that's quite a lot of work and it's very variable and it changes each year. So we have a more like it's a kind of in a way a vague approach. We like give each score a ranking. So we go through like the lettuce. We say, okay, days to maturity, it's kind of like somewhere in the middle. It's like a 3 out of 5. Ease of growing is pretty easy. So it's actually pretty hard. It takes like quite a lot of irrigation and it's quite a tender crop and things like that. It's can bolt, so let's give it a 2. Yield's quite high, sales value is quite high. So lettuce gets a score of 12, for example. And anything that gets a score of 7 or less, maybe we should consider not growing it. And then maybe we look in more detail at those crops that are a maybe. So those crops that we just know that we're definitely going to grow. Like now we've done this for all of our crops. So we know we're going to do radish, we know we're going to do spring onion, parsley, squash, chard, spinach, kale, salad. Also some when we do this for the field crops, also things like purple sprite and broccoli, squash, Jerusalem artichoke. So it's still staple crops. It's not just we're not just going to end up with just salad. So I think salad's actually like our number 7 profitable crop. So it's not all about the salads. Um, So we do that for all the crops, and that gives us proper information we can use for crop planning. Um, so that's a little activity could do. I might just leave you guys with that to do in your own time, and then we'll sort of can finish a little earlier then. But maybe it'd be useful to say if you what do you think your most profitable crops are? Maybe if anyone wants to like share in the chat or just shout out like maybe like top three of what they suspect will come out as like top profitable crops. Does anyone want to share? It can be just a on intuition based.
The only thing I can think is things like salad and cucumber and tomato are my top three in my head. Salad, obviously, yeah, salad pick and come again, so you can get constant harvest from it, and the same with tomatoes and things. You get a slightly higher price, I assume.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, they're good goers. Any others? People most profitable?
Yeah, salad, cucumbers, like you said, radish, the ones that you can just quickly, you can with a
Mm,
tiny bit of space, you can
yeah,
get a lot out of.
yeah,
Um, Squash, probably. It's quite a good one.
yeah. Swiss quite a good one. Fairly low labor, I guess, once you've got it in. Um, nice. Yeah. I think I found it as such an interesting process to go through because I think we had a list of the crops we thought were most profitable. And then it does. There's some are just like really reaffirmed and confirmed through this process, and also you might want to choose different variables depending on your situation, like if weeding is really important or different things like that. But this kind of set of variables of like value, yield, labor efficiency, input efficiency, are really useful. I find because it kind of can cover all bases. We did used to use more like specifics. We even did like the days and the time it's in the ground, all these different. We had quite a complex one, and that now I kind of look at more like these four main things, and actually it comes out with very different, kind of in a way, quite different scores to what I would have expected. Um, and it'll be totally different in every context because you'll give these a score based on your context. So, for example, for us, the labor efficiency of some crops is like really, really high because of the tools we've got. Um, so yeah, like the labor efficiency of like parsley, for example, really quick. We'll just like direct sow it, and then it's just a really quick, easy crop for us. And like the input efficiency is based on how much um, inputs like in terms of how much attention it needs, how much compost it needs, all of those different things. So we kind of give them all like a different ranking. And the yield across the year is important because when you're looking at market gardening, um, some crops will just have a certain window. So actually, squash, the yield across the year, we might get 3 tons per acre. That's great. But we've only got one crop in that year. Or maybe we've got the squash and then we've got a yield of spring garlic in the same bed or something like that. But the yield quantity across the year of like radish, technically you can crop the same bed, a lot of times through that year. So you might have, doesn't mean you necessarily do radish in the same bed, but actually if you had radish, then spring onion, then radish, then a winter green, and then a spring garlic, then you can look at the average yield quantity can be really quite high. So again, similarly like tomatoes are quite slow to start cropping, and then they crop in this short window. It goes over quite quickly the summer crop, and they might have a really good value, and they might have quite good yield for that time of for that couple of months or so. But maybe the labor efficiency they might get a really low score on because actually the amount of time into the pruning, into the the watering, the polytunnel management, all that sort of thing, then actually the labor efficiency score might be quite low, and the input efficiency score might be quite low because we've got to like make some comfrey feed to feed them, make some nettle tea, and they're quite hungry. Tomato crops, and they require more inputs because they need more compost maybe because of that, and they need polytunnel space, which is an input, and etc. So they might have quite a low score on those. So sometimes quite interesting of what comes out from the numbers and what we sort of might think are most profitable, and then what becomes. And I think it's good to sort of factor in all of the economics, because I think we can focus on like the price we get and maybe the yield from that one harvest. But when we look at all of like the multi-harvest, the multi-cropping, the market garden factors, how much labour, things we can direct sow. This is why they're so great. They'll make so much more sense. They'll have much better scores on the labour efficiency. And things that aren't very hungry crops and things that are potentially really input efficient and don't really need the composted beds and stuff, they might come up really high in other ways. So yeah, I find it really fascinating to like, we went through that journey, and then I think our top crops there were some things we'd expect in there, but some things like we didn't necessarily expect, things like Jerusalem artichokes and patty pans to be quite high up the list. Kale was really high, just it's kind of cut and come again. Perpetual spinach is probably one of our top ones just because of the multi-crop factor. Salad's quite high up there, but it's not right at the top. It's something like number 7 or 8. Parsley's really high. Spring onions and radish are really high. So it wasn't always what we necessarily expect. Beetroot's very high because it's just seems so easy, and the labour efficiency is quite good, and we can direct sow it. So yeah, it's always interesting just to like reflect on and see what actually works. And suddenly, if you change your crop plan to, rather than just growing a bit of everything and like that sort of thing, and you change it to maybe there's like 12 crops that are really, really profitable, and you do kind of marketing around that, and you really develop the relationship with those plants, then suddenly the economics of that market garden can totally flip, and it can be maybe generating twice as much income in the same year. And you can have much more harvest efficiency. Maybe you've chosen lower labor crops, and it can just free up a lot of stuff. And it's good to just check. It's good to simplify, and then you can always grow back out. Like we got rid of quite a lot of crops ruthlessly, and we still had a good diversity, but we really pared it down. We used to just grow something like 70 varieties of plants, including all the species and things like that. We really pared it right down to 15, 20, and then this year we're kind of growing it out a bit more. Like we are doing more diverse varieties of PSB, so we have a more successional crop, so we can grow that variety out and diversity from that base of it, making sure it's viable first, if that makes sense. And then just to summarize a bit of like zooming back into like the market garden, like growing variables. So I think we've covered all of these, but just these would be like the top ones for me, is like in terms of the actual market garden growing. Like even get like high value crops, short days to maturity, things like radishes. They're there within 3.5 weeks in the summer. They're like already ready. So you've got £200 from a bed, 200 bunch of radish within 3 weeks. That's really short days to maturity. Parsnips are in the ground for 90 to 120 days, and you get like 40 pence per square area of ground versus like 5 bunches of radish or whatever. So looking at that space and short days to maturity, functional diversity, focusing on those really good functional crops, high rotation multi-cropping especially for the smaller market gardens. On the bigger market gardens, maybe more of a cover crop integration, living pathways, appropriate level of multi-cropping. Season extension, year-round cropping, low inputs, optimizing the labor input. So obviously getting in the labor you need to get those systems really good, but more labor isn't always more. More labor doesn't always help more. It's finding the optimum labor for that site and for that kind of team dynamics and things like that. And regular sales, in terms of we're harvesting most days, we're selling most days, the delivery vehicles are going out. Sometimes in the summer it'll be Monday for wholesale, Tuesday for the local restaurants and cafes and stuff. Wednesday the deliveries have a day off. Thursday it's doing veg boxes. Friday it's doing wholesale and veg boxes. Saturday it's markets. Sometimes a Sunday market. So it's like there's constant income flow. I think that's really important, because if you've got the pressure to make all of your income from your farm from one day, say we're just harvesting on Thursday, which we used to do, and we had to generate all of our income for the whole team from that one Thursday, that means we'd have had to harvest like 3 grand's worth of produce just on that Thursday when we were quite a small operation, to cover all the labour costs and all the stuff for that week. Whereas if we, going back to that weekly cash sort of income flow analysis, when we spread all that income through the week and we're doing lots of that through the week, then we've got 2 grand coming that day, £500 that day, 700 that day, and it all just adds up to a good weekly income for all the different labor roles and overheads that are needed. So that kind of regularity of sales can really help, and obviously requires the marketing and focus for it as well. And I think that is it in terms of the webinar and sort of whistle stop tour of like growing economics. And if you want any other support, I do a little bit of consulting in the winter, and it's earthcareservices.co.uk. And yeah, I really love doing that in terms of like, yeah, supporting like farms to thrive as much as possible. And sometimes it's just being a sounding board and sharing mistakes that I've sort of learned from so other people don't do it. And sometimes it's help, more like detailed help with like designs or with, yeah, implementation stuff or like organizational or bits like that. Just sharing lessons. So always welcome to reach out, although I'm quite full till winter, till next winter. um, yeah, any questions on any of those bits or the session as a whole? I'll just flick back so in case it sparks any curiosities.